Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I'm Allison Brown. This is Justin Brown. We're the co-directors of the Henry's Fork Wildlife Alliance. We're coming to you from Island Park, Idaho. So a little bit of history on how this kind of came to be. Last October, Justin and myself and Matt Lucia, who's in this call, were at a conference in Kalispell, the International Human Bear Conflict Workshop. And we saw Heather's talk, and it just really struck us as very timely and reflective of some of the challenges that we've faced here in East Idaho with human bear conflicts. So we started scheming. By the time Heather's talk was done, Justin and myself and Matt had all been texting, and we just decided that we had to have Heather do this talk. And so luckily she was game, and so here we are. Heather's actually coming to us from the USGS Alaska Science Center in Anchorage. She conducts research there on caribou and the Arctic ecosystem. Her expertise spans population ecology, resource selection, human-wildlife conflict, predator-prey relationships, endangered species conservation, large mammal ecology, and management, and the effects of land use change on wildlife populations. We're thrilled to have Dr. Johnson here to share her innovative and influential research. We're grateful for all of you being here tonight, and this is a collaborative effort between Henry's Fork Wildlife Alliance and Greater Yellowstone Coalition. All right, Dr. Johnson, I'll have you take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. First, I really want to thank Justin, Allison, and Matt for hosting this tonight. And thank you to all, for joining tonight. I'm super excited to be able to speak with you about this stuff. This is a topic I get really excited about. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so I know sometimes Zoom talks are a little rough, so I'm gonna try to keep you guys all engaged. I've got a lot of cool material to go through with you guys. If there's something that comes up that I'm not aware of, just take us off mute and jump in. But today I want to talk with you about research that I did while I started doing this work while working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I used to be a researcher for the State Wildlife Agency in Colorado. And that's where I really kind of dug into this topic in detail, and then I've kind of continued a little bit in my work now with USGS. And so tonight, I want to talk about this issue of human-bear conflicts. We all are really familiar with what conflict looks like, especially, I imagine all you guys live in bear country. You've experienced conflict, you hear about it in the news, you see it in the, you deal with it with your neighbors and your communities. We talk and think a lot about conflict. Tonight, what I want to focus on and think about and get us to think about collectively is, what does it look like to coexist? And really focus on this coexistence piece. And what does that look like? And when we talk about bear-human conflicts, minimize this. Inherently, we're talking about these two components, the bear side and the human side of things. We've got this kind of, the bear side is the ecological side, and then we've got this human piece. And, we're recognizing just with that term that there's this, this break between these pieces that needs to get resolved. And so, how do we get there? How do we move from this kind of state of conflict into a state of coexistence? So what I want to talk about today is a lot of the lessons and the insights we learned from doing a lot of research specifically on this topic. I started working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife in 2010 and spent 7 years just like really embedded in the field and working on this topic and collecting a lot of data on this topic. During those years, this kind of work, it was my life. It's what we did 24/7. During the project, I was pregnant. I had a baby who became a toddler who came out in the field with me all the time on this project, which was mostly fun. It was not always fun, as you can tell from this picture here. We had some interesting times parenting also in the field. But, this this was kind of all encapturing of kind of what life was during these years. Um, and as you'll kind of see through this talk, has kind of continued to the story has kind of continued to evolve and unfold as the years have passed. Now my kiddo, this picture, he was 3, now he just turned 12 last week. And throughout the talk I'm going to give tonight, I'm going to sprinkle in these little video clips from Dusty's film, Bears of Durango. This is the one that's going to get shown, I guess, 3 times, 3 screenings over the next couple weeks. And so I'm hoping the video clips are going to, help build your interest for attending one of those screenings. Dusty I'm going to talk about the science we did on this topic tonight and what we've learned from the research side of things. Dusty's taken that and he's created this film that just kind of really brings the research to life in this fun, engaging way. So I really do hope that you'll see that in the upcoming screenings. Okay, so initially I was hired by Colorado Parks and Wildlife to investigate this issue of what was driving increases in human-bear conflicts. So at the time there had been, a couple years before I got hired, there had been some preliminary work on this topic, and they'd seen, this big increase in conflicts over time. And actually I'm going to ask, with Justin or Allison, can you guys see my cursor scrolling around? I just want to make sure that if I use it, folks can see that. Can you see that going on?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so there had been this big increase in conflicts occurring. And what was interesting and kind of different about it was in the past, conflicts were largely related to things like livestock and the sheep grazing and things. But the conflicts that were happening in Colorado were really tied to these human communities, towns. That's where the conflicts were occurring. And that was a little different than what people had dealt with before. And often what happens is when you have more conflicts, the knee-jerk reaction is to increase harvest, and that had happened in different places in Colorado. And so harvest was increasing, so more bears are being killed through harvest and through other means. This red part here is bears being killed, roadkill and other lethal kind of removals. So a lot of more bears are being killed over time, and yet conflicts were still increasing, especially around towns. Now, at the time, there were a couple key assumptions that were really kind of the basis for what was happening with bear management in response to conflicts. The first big assumption was that, once a problem bear, it's always going to be a problem bear. And the kind of solution for that was that you remove those bears. You remove them maybe through translocation or lethally, but if you kind of get rid of the problem individual, that you're going to fix the problem. And we're going to come back to this idea later on. The other kind of common assumption was that if there's more conflicts, it must mean that there's more bears. And so again, what's the accepted solution? Well, you can increase harvest, because if this is a numerical problem, there's just too many bears. If you increase harvest, that should reduce the bears and reduce the conflicts. So this was happening also in Colorado. And so, for example, right when I moved to Colorado, around Aspen, harvest had just been increased by 250% to deal with the increase in conflicts. Despite that, conflicts were not going away. So, there were these kind of management strategies happening to reduce conflicts, but they just weren't working. And so that's what I was brought on to research, was really to understand, why were bear-human conflicts increasing? And the idea here was to understand, is it because bears are changing their behavior? Is it because you have all around these towns and human development, you have all this extra human food that's changing how bears behave, and that's driving up conflicts? Is it because we have more bears? All this extra food on the landscape is increasing bear survival and reproduction and population sizes, and that's the cause? Or maybe it's some combination of these. And ultimately, Colorado Parks and Wildlife wanted to understand, what should we do about it? What's going to be the most effective management strategy to reduce conflicts? Is it going to be reducing human food? Is it going to be increasing harvest? What's going to work to fix this problem? So we set up a research project to address these questions. And, I started off by showing you kind of these two bubbles, right? The ecological side and the human side. And admittedly, our research project was largely set up to really tackle this ecological side of things. And I see this a lot with what happens, especially with these carnivore human conflict kinds of studies and things, is you put someone like me in charge of it, and I'm trained as a wildlife ecologist. When I look at a problem, I think about the wildlife, right? And that is super pervasive in our field. When I worked for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we had about 900 employees, and we had one social scientist. One person to really focus on the kind of this human piece with tons of biologists and wildlife managers and researchers. We were all focused on kind of the wildlife, but not so much on that human side of things. So our project was largely to understand kind of the ecological side of this system. And so I want to talk first tonight about the ecological system and what we learned about it. And we decided to do the research around Durango in the southwest corner of Colorado. As you can see from the map here, this was a town that was experiencing a lot of bear-human interactions and conflicts. It's a town that's nestled right in great bear habitat. And this is a place where I'm going to play a clip from Dusty's film because he does a really great job of introducing this study area.
So Durango sits in the middle of La Plata County, and human development in La Plata County has experienced a fourfold increase in the last 20 years. You put that critter on this landscape, and you kind of set up this perfect storm really for lots of conflicts and interactions between bears and people.
The bear sightings continue in Durango.
The bear managed to get inside, busted his way out, and tried to take the garbage can with him.
Even the bears in our state love Subarus.
But actually seeing it in my car, I was like, well, I'm really not going to work today.
Unfortunately, Smith does not have comprehensive coverage, so that bear damage will not be covered by insurance.
A Colorado woman turned into a mama bear when a real bear got really close to her two young sons.
I've never been afraid of a bear before, but I am now afraid of bears.
Look closely. The bear has a green tag in its ear. That is not a good sign. That indicates the bear has one strike. Colorado Parks and Wildlife typically put down animals with two strikes. Witnesses say you could definitely tell the bear was distressed.
It is the latest in a series of bear encounters in the Durango area.
He's going right up to the front door.
All the bears looking for the same thing, food.
Okay, I hope you guys could hear and see that okay. Sorry about the little glitch there in the middle. Yeah, and I guess Justin or Allison, let me know if there's any technical issues I should be aware of. Okay, and so before I really dig into kind of details of what we learned from the study, I just want to put up a quick slide that just recognizes that there are a ton of people that worked with me on this. So many field technicians, collaborators, partners, folks from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, from the USDA, National Wildlife Research Center, from the city of Durango, and from Colorado State University. So I'm going to say we a lot tonight, and there's a huge number of people involved with we. Okay, well, what we did on this ecological side to collect data on this project is we went out and we collared a lot of bears. Our intention was to go out and trap and collar bears in the vicinity of Durango. We focused within about 10 kilometers of town. And we wanted to catch a sample of bears that all had access to both natural foods and human foods associated with town. So we conducted over 5,800 trap nights, putting traps in over 280 different locations, working with all the public landowners, but also 160 private landowners to do this. And over the course of the 6-year study, we conducted over 1,000 bear captures. And we marked 625 different bears. This was a little bit mind-blowing for folks. When I first went to Durango and asked some of the wildlife biologists and managers, how many bears do you think we can catch around Durango for this study? One person told me 10. Another person told me 20 or 25. So, I think the numbers were a little surprising. Our goal was to collar adult female bears. Females tell us the most about populations since they're the reproductive segment. So our goal is to have about 40 bears collared per year. So we go out in the summer, we trap and collar these bears, and then we track and see what they did throughout the year. We collected hourly locations from these bears, and so, man, over the course of the study, we collected almost 1 million locations. Durango's like buried under all these points here, but we collected a ton of data of bears in this Durango system. And then we'd track those female bears to their dens in the winter, and we go to the dens and we do things like swap out the batteries on their collar, but we'd also do things like look at their body condition, see how much weight they'd gained. We'd see if they had cubs. Did their cubs, for cubs, they stay with their moms the first year of life and then den with their moms again that next winter. So we'd get to see, if a female had cubs last year, did they survive to yearlings this year? And then collect a whole bunch of biological samples on these animals. So we visited 190 dens over the course of the study too. And here's a little snippet from what it kind of looks like crawling into these dens in the winter.
We walk up to the den. Try to get the bear stuck as quick as we can. And then close it up with backpacks. So sometimes it goes smooth and sometimes it doesn't. It's exciting, I guess.
I mean, if she really wants to go, you can just Spider-Man the walls and she can go under you.
Fuck me.
Oh, she's doing something.
Nice shot.
Okay, so lots of excitement collecting some of this data sometimes. And so now I want to talk a little bit about what we learned. So we collected all this data, what did we learn about it, especially in terms of how human development and kind of how human development affected bear behavior and what that means from this conflict perspective that we're talking about. So the first thing we learned is kind of a no-brainer, but it was nice to see in the data that bears are in developed areas because they're there to access human food. And so bears that spent more time in human development were eating more human food, and so that's why they're there. And the way we actually could tell this is we took hair samples from bears and we captured them and went to their dens. And when bears eat a lot of human food, our human foods have so much, they're so processed, they have these, they have a lot more corn and cane sugar in them, and that means that they have much higher levels of this carbon-13. And so bears that spent more time in human development had this really enriched carbon-13, indicating that, yep, these bears had been eating a lot of human food. So, we've seen that here in town. Folks have seen it in a variety of other studies as well, bear studies, both around kind of urban environments and agricultural areas. Pretty much if you see bears around human development, they're there for the food. And what we've learned is that, they're there for the food, but they really don't want to be around people to get it. This data came from a different study in Colorado done in Aspen, led by Sharon Brock-Murdo. And the red here, this shows over the course of the day, the x-axis is time of day, bear activities, and it's measured by how many movements they're doing with these collars. And so the red is what bears do in a normal year. In a normal year, they're diurnal. They're during the summer, they're most active in the morning, and then again in the evening. They kind of siesta during the middle of the day, and that's what a normal bear should do. But in Aspen, when you had these really poor natural food years, bears were eating a lot of human food coming into town, and they switched, now this gray and black line, they switched to being nocturnal. They were active at night, and during the day, they're basically hiding out from people, and then they'd come out and get active again at night and come into town and forage on human foods. And so while they want those human foods and are using them and eating them around human development. They're trying to kind of access the human foods while like avoiding people as much as they can. That's how they're reacting there. We also learned that bears hibernated less when they ate more human foods and were using human development. We could tell that, again, because these collars that we put out measure bear activity. And so we could see, based on their activity levels, when a bear basically stopped becoming active and started their hibernation. So this is a plot from one bear's collar, just showing you that, here at kind of mid-late October, this bear's activity patterns just drops. And at that point, she's hibernating. And so we could tell the date when a bear essentially started hibernating and when they ended hibernation. And we could see that the bears that spent more time around human development, their duration, the number of days that they hibernated, was less. So we had this kind of direct effect. And so that meant that bears that were spending more time using development were also, awake more of the year and had more of the year to interact with people. So bears, are eating human foods anyway. That allows them to have more kind of interactions and potential conflicts with people. But then those same bears are also hibernating for a shorter period of time, which also enables them to have more interactions, more of the year with people. From the study, we also found that bears increase their use of human development as they get older. This was really interesting to us because the perception often is that it's juveniles and young bears that are really getting into trouble and causing conflicts. My perception after working on this a lot is that those are the bears that often get caught. But there's a lot of very savvy older bears that have learned kind of how to not get caught, but definitely rely on human development and human foods. And so in our study, we just saw that as bears got older, they seemed to learn about human foods and, kind of use them as needed, especially as they aged and as they gained more experience with it. And this was the real kicker. We found that bears used human foods, especially when their natural foods were scarce. So, bears don't use human foods in all cases. As I already showed you, they don't want to be around people generally. So they really want to kind of avoid people. And if there's good natural foods, they'll often just use those because they don't want anything to do with people. But when natural foods are scarce or you have these food failure years, that's where we saw bears really switch and they would go to human foods for subsidy. And so in this plot here, this is the x-axis here is density of human development. And on the y-axis, I have the probability of bear selection. And I've got two colors. The warm colors is what bears are doing in a, I'll start with the green, what bears are doing in a good natural food year. And the warm colors, what they're doing in a bad natural food year. Like there's not much to eat. And what we found is that, man, in a bad natural food year where there's just nothing for bears to eat, they really increase their selection for especially high levels of human development because that's where they're going for food. And this is what that looked like. When we had good natural foods around Durango in the summer, bears were picking these these red hot spots. They were generally staying out of town. Now these cooler colors are areas bears were avoiding. They generally avoided town and they were picking these north-facing slopes that had, more shrub and kind of mixed aspen forests that had good foods for them. They were a little cooler. That's where they were wanting to hang out. But when we had poor natural foods, there just wasn't much for them to eat. It switched. And now, town was like a magnet. I mean, high probability of use and selection by bears coming into town to get those other human food resources. And, also there was this trade-off. Again, bears didn't really want to use those human foods, so generally speaking, if there were other natural foods available. But when those natural foods were scarce, they just kind of like tipped the balance. And then it's worth taking on that risk coming around people to use those extra human foods. So this is a little animation showing the movements of one bear at B25 over a course of 3 years. So the first year here is 2011, and this was a good natural food year. Now here, this is Durango, here kind of the downtown core. This bear is using what's known as Lightner Creek and behaving just like we want a bear to do. All summer, she's just kind of bouncing around the drainage there using natural foods. Now we're in 2012. This was a major food failure year. I'll talk about this more, but this was a year where there's not much for bears to eat. And you can see she kind of increases her movement. She's kind of looking for food. Midsummer, she's really extending where she goes, and then she beelines right to downtown, and she spends the rest of her summer, right in town, and then she goes back out to den. Now 2013 in green, this was a good food year again. There was good food on the forest for her, and she stays hanging out really around that Lightner Creek area, again, west of town, and doesn't come back. So, a lot of times we hear that perception like, well, once a bear discovers some food or, problem bear, they're always going to be a problem bear. Not necessarily. This is a bear that generally wanted to use, natural foods and behave as we want a bear to do. But kind of when times were tough and in desperation, what's amazing to me about this is when times were tough, she didn't like accidentally find Durango and stumble into it. She went from Junction Creek here to downtown, and she went in 2 hours. She was here an hour, town an hour. She knew exactly where she was going. She had experience in the past. She must have getting food there. She knew exactly where to go when she needed it. And when she needed it, she just hung out right in town. Okay, so what we found was is that these years where you had scarce natural foods were associated with major increases in human-bear conflicts. So on the y-axis here, this is the calls that came into the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Office in Durango over the years of our study. And so blue are the calls, and you can see the calls spike in 2012 and 2017, and they spike during these years. The red is the natural food in our natural food index. The years where the kind of natural foods decline and we have really poor natural foods, that's when we have those calls spike. Yeah, man, bears are looking for food, and they'll come to town to look for food if they need to, and that's when those conflicts really skyrocket. Okay, so that's what we learned about, how bears were kind of behaviorally responding to town and these food resources. But then we also looked at what the effect was on their populations, and we wanted to understand, how that was related to the conflicts we're seeing. And this is an important question because a lot of times people, around town, when they see bears around town, bears, they are big. They've been eating really well, so they're big bears. They often have a lot of cubs. In Durango, it's really rare to see a bear with 3 cubs, but man, you'd see it in town. So it just, there's this perception that this extra food is really causing these big increases in bear populations. At the same time, what we know is around town, there's a lot of mortality also of bears. So, this kind of question of, is this extra human food and human development, is this causing bear populations to increase or decrease? We wanted to sort that out. So we looked at our locations from all these different bears, and we could see what % of the time did they spend around human development. And then we could see how that related to things like their body fat, their cub productivity, like how many cubs did they produce, what was the survival of those cubs, and what was their survival as an adult female. So we looked at all this, and what we found was that the results were really mixed. We saw that in terms of body fat, bears that spent more time in areas that were developed, had more development, they were fatter. They were getting those extra human food resources, as I showed you, and that definitely had a benefit in terms of increasing their body fat. And we found that bears that spent more time around development, they had more cubs. So the probability of having triplets really increased the screen line as bears spent more time around development. We saw that, though, that the survival of those cubs declined as bears spent more time around development. So there's just a lot of hazards for bears in those landscapes, especially, bears getting hit by cars. We had cubs get electrocuted climbing up power poles. Bears dying because they break into a shed and need a bucket of rat poison. I mean, just all kinds of ways that bears die in and around developed areas, especially cubs. We also saw that adult female survival declined as they spent more time around development. But the big question was, we saw these kind of mixed, we have this kind of increase in reproduction, but decline in survival. What are the collective effects on the population? To look at that, we used a population model where we could really model out these different effects and understand what their kind of relative contributions were in terms of population dynamics. And what we found was that as bears increased their use of development, the population was projected to decline. This is a little bit tricky of a figure, but this the dotted line here at 1, the idea here is that above 1, the population is growing. Below 1, the population is predicted to decline. What we found was that our population in a medium food year, if bears don't use any human development, it was predicted to be right about 1, like a stable population. And only in really good natural food years was the bear population expected to increase. But what we found was in low natural food years, the bear population was expected to decline even if there was no effect of human development. But especially as bears increased their use of development, the population was especially predicted to decline. And then we saw this really dramatic, we saw this play out in a really dramatic way. Because in addition to kind of collaring all these bears and collecting really detailed data on these individuals, what we also did was we went out on the landscape and set up all these hare snares. And so here's Durango and all around town, we set up these stations. And this is in 16, you can see the scale down here. I mean, 16 kilometers, 20 kilometers probably crosses the study area. So this is a big area. Each one of these black triangles represented a hare snare that we set up on the landscape where we put some stinky, like a stinky bait smell, and we ring it with some low barbed wire around some trees, and bears come in because they smell that bait and want to check it out. And then as they step over the wire, they leave a little tuft of hair, and we could collect the hair and do the genetics on it to get a DNA fingerprint for every bear, and then estimate the bear population size. So we did this over the first 4 years of our study. We collected over 2,500 bear hair samples to get our population estimates from. And this is what we found for female bear abundance. So in the first 4 years of the study, here was the trend. In 2012, we estimated about 200 female bears in our population. But the next year, it was down to about 83, I think, bears in 2013. And that was in association with this big natural food shortage that we had. So I told you, all these bears, well, actually, let me talk about the food shortage real quick. So in our system, key foods that bears were eating were things like acorns from gambleoak, fruit from chokecherry, crabapple, and serviceberry plants. And this shows you kind of the index of how good those natural foods were in different years of our study. And you can see in 2012, like, the index is 0 for all these different bear foods. There was just nothing for bears to eat. This was the year that coincided with this just intense change where bears came to town looking for food. And was followed by, as I showed you, that bears that come to town, they suffer a lot of mortality. And so what we saw was that here on the y-axis is the number of bear mortalities in different years in the Durango system. In 2012, this is that food failure year, we had this big spike in mortalities when bears are coming, looking for those extra food sources. And, that is associated with this big decline in the population. And not only did we see the population decline, but we actually just fundamentally saw bear distributions get shifted across the landscape. Where before we had the food failure, this is a map predicting bear densities across the landscape. And so like the darker colors here indicate areas that would have more bears. Durango sits right here, and these are the major highways coming into Durango. This would be going up towards Silverton. And then you can see after we had that food failure, here is the predicted landscape of how bears are distributed on the landscape. And now you can kind of see, there are no more green spots, or, those kind of hot spots have dramatically diminished. And we just had this emptying out of bears after that major food failure. Now, all these little cross marks on the map, these are places that we found or detected bear mortalities, bears that had died. And you can see they're concentrated heavily around the roads, around major highways, at least. I don't have all the roads on here, but just the major highways. And just generally, we have this bear densities just really dropped in these kind of developed areas along, developed areas here in association with a lot of bear mortality that happened when bears came into those places to get those human food resources. Okay, so this is how Dusty tells the story. Oh, sorry, not quite yet. Okay, so did conflicts change after we saw this big population decline? That's kind of been this implicit assumption that, if you reduce the number of bears, then you can reduce conflicts. So here again is that what I just showed you, our estimate of bear abundance over the first 4 years of our study. And here was the number of calls that came into the whole system in terms of conflicts. Came into CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but also into the city and into the local bear nonprofit. And what you can see is that when we had that natural food failure, the number of calls that experienced an over a 5-fold increase. This was this huge spike in 2012 and associated with that food failure event in terms of conflicts. But after we went back to having decent natural foods, now in 2013, our bear population is halved, but we have about the same number of conflicts as we did before. We don't see a halving in the conflicts because our population declined by half. Conflicts stayed the same, if not a little higher. So, just kind of demonstrating this idea that conflicts here is not being driven by population size, but by this change in behavior, in bear behavior, especially associated with changes in natural foods and bears kind of using those human foods as a source of subsidy. Okay, here's the clip from Dusty's film telling the story.
So in 2012, we had this massive food failure event. So what happens, we had a really late hard freeze that happened in June where all the plants had flowered out. And that hard freeze just killed all the flowers, so we just get no production, no berries, no acorns. And there was almost just nothing for the bears to eat that year. We do surveys for foods for the bears each fall, and we quantify the amount of food available for bears in our transects.
In this area, how likely are they to use these natural food sources? How available are the natural food sources to them compared to, other years where maybe there wasn't as much natural food and they had to rely on human-created food sources instead?
Our average food available for bears on our transects was 0. That was the average. So they turned to human foods as a source of subsidy. So we had bears, a lot of bears in our system, pretty much 90%, 85% come in and really use human food resources, garbage, bird seed, all the kinds of foods you have around town. The trick with that is that when those bears come into town, then they're susceptible to all these mortality factors. being hit on the road by cars, being lethally removed or being killed basically for nuisance behavior. So we have bears that get put down for breaking into a house or a garage or for killing livestock. So that food failure event was accompanied by bears coming into town and then suffering a lot of mortality as a consequence.
Was that the bear calling for its mama? Yeah. It's like bears making a noise.
We watched the bear population of Durango be estimated at about 202 female bears down to 84 female bears. This is a pretty unprecedented decline, especially in a single year in a steady area. Now, in a wild system where bears don't use human food resources, they don't have access to human food, we would just never see that. You might see a little downturn in the population, mostly due to lack of reproduction. When times are tough, they put their energy into surviving themselves so they can reproduce another day. And so that's what you'd see normally. But in these systems, or in these urban environments around Durango, what we saw is this behavioral shift where bears use human food and then suffer these really high mortality rates.
Okay, so that is what we learned from the Durango system on the ecological side of things. And importantly, based on lots of publications around the world on different bear species in different contexts and different geographies, we've seen that the patterns we've seen in Durango are largely universal. We've seen the same things happen with brown bears in Europe and grizzly bears in coastal British Columbia. We've seen the same pattern show up in polar bears in the Arctic, with black bears in the agricultural areas. I mean, really across bear species and different places and contexts, what we see is bears increase their use of human food when natural foods are scarce. This causes an increase in conflicts. And this often leads then to reduced bear survival and population sinks or declines. And the important thing too here is that, we expect these patterns are likely to continue with expected increases in climate, land use, and human densities. So this shows you, changes in temperature for Colorado. And, what we expect is with climate change that we're going to see these natural food failure events more frequently. We also know lots of places we're going to see the human population increase. This is the changes in the Colorado state population. And so not only are we going to have more food failure events, we're also going to have more people on the landscape to contend with to be able to get in conflict. So, that we should expect these kinds of patterns to not only continue but be exacerbated in the future. Okay, the good news though is that now that we understand the drivers of conflicts, now we can shift to focusing on the solutions and kind of working towards getting us to coexistence. And to do that, I want to kind of start shifting gears a little bit and talking more about this human side and bringing in kind of the human side of the puzzle into the picture. So let's talk about solutions. And we're going to talk about solutions. Well, I'll first talk about the ecological side of solutions, then I'm going to talk about the human side of things. So when we think about solutions for how to resolve conflicts, what do we know about the ecological side of things on the kind of the bear side of things? Well, the short answer is that based on research, based on lots of studies that have happened on this topic, kind of the punchline is that solutions focused on bears have generally not been very effective. And I know that certain contexts and certain study areas can be unique, but generally this has been kind of the major message when we look at the published literature. And so I want to look at a few different strategies here. Now the first one, thinking about translocations. Translocations are often a pretty popular management strategy from a public perspective. The idea that kind of take the problem elsewhere, but you don't hurt the bear. So there's been lots of translocations that have occurred over time and lots of research on how effective translocations are. Milligan et al. 2018, given this kind of picture on the left, they looked at how successful grizzly bear translocations were, looking at, I think, about 110 that happened in Alberta. They found that 70% of those failed. Either the bear died the first year or got into more complex situations. Voiles et al. In 2015 did a study looking at live trapping and moving bears and whether that was effective from a management strategy. And they found that that strategy too just was not effective for reducing complaints over time. And in both cases, they found that, because translocation or live trapping does not necessarily affect a bear's conflict behavior, nor does it remove the source of the conflict, repeat conflict or mortality become highly likely. And that's what they found, like in this Voiles paper, they found that, well, if you can take the bear, you can live trap and move the bear someplace else. But if you don't move the source of what caused the conflict to start with, like the food source or whatever was there that kind of drew the bear in to start with, it's a different bear is going to come in and get to the same problem. Aversive conditioning. That's been the source of a lot of energy and effort put towards reducing bear-human conflicts. Lots of ways to do this, but this was a really nice study that Homestall et al. Looked at this. They published a paper in 2024 where folks had spent a lot of time hazing bears in Whistler in British Columbia, where they shot bears that came into town with rubber bullets and paintballs and other kind of projectiles. And what they found was they could get, if they shot bears with all this stuff, bears would become more wary, for sure, but they didn't change their use of town. That here, both, there was no change in the aversive conditioning group before and after the experiment in terms of how they used human-dominated habitat, these developed areas. There's no significant difference in this kind of that use both during the day or during the night. They just could not move the needle, no matter how many projectiles they shot at these bears. They were still getting a benefit somewhere, this food benefit somewhere, and you can't be everywhere to shoot a projectile at a bear or to haze a bear. And so that intermittent reward is pretty darn powerful. And so these guys concluded that aversive conditioning does not alter bear use of human-dominant spaces, highlighting the importance of proactive, attractive management. Again, they're coming for the attractants. And if you don't manage the attractants, this is not going to be very effective. And finally, I want to talk about harvest. Harvest is often used. It's kind of it's an easy knob for management agencies often to turn, and so it's often kind of the go-to to reduce conflicts, kind of increase harvest, thinking that if you reduce bear population, you're going to alleviate conflicts. Joe Northrup and colleagues published a really nice paper in 2023 where they had done this big management experiment. Around Ontario, they had these different management units, and in a portion of them, they added another hunt, and so they really increased hunting pressure on bears and looked to see whether increasing harvest could reduce conflict. They were super effective at increasing harvest and the number of bears harvested, but they did not change the number of conflicts. In fact, conflicts actually went up in areas that received more harvest. They did not decrease. And this has been shown in lots of studies that increasing harvest just has not been very effective at reducing conflicts. The study concluded that harvest was ineffective at reducing human-bear interactions and incidents. Our results show that natural food availability is the primary driver of conflict. Programs promoting coexistence between people and wildlife, including management of unnatural food sources, likely will be the most successful at reducing conflicts. So, over and over again, we see that these kind of bear-focused solutions aren't showing much success. Instead, all these authors are concluding that what you really need to do is manage the attractants. Okay, so let's talk about that then, and really kind of zero in on this human side of things and really think about solutions that are focused on the human side. So in the Durango system, we finally did kind of get on board that it wasn't just the ecological side of things we needed to understand, but it was also the human side. So we did build that in to some of the work that we did. And we looked at how effective it was to do this wide-scale urban bear proofing. This was a solution that Parks and Wildlife was suggesting to towns that what you really need to do if you want to reduce conflicts is you need to lock up your trash and make sure bears can't access the garbage. But, folks were saying, well, it's really expensive to change your waste management practices. And how do we know that's really going to work? I mean, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. Towns needed to know that this was really going to work before they invested in it. So Parks and Wildlife took this on in this kind of amazing way. We did this massive experiment in Durango where we split up the city into 4 treatment units. We had 4 experimental units. We had 2 treatment areas and 2 control areas. And we deployed over 1,100 bear-resistant trash containers into our 2 treatment areas. So these red zones here, these were areas where every house received a free bear-resistant trash container. And then the green areas were places that just, had their regular trash can. That they were our controls. This is a photo of Lyle, who worked with me. He and I helping get ready 1,000 trash cans to put out into people in Durango. We collected 2 years of data in 2011 and 2012, just pre-treatment, before we put out any containers. We collected some data. And then we collected 4 years of data after we put out all these bear cans. And this describes...
So as part of the study, we've deployed about 1,100 bear-resistant trash containers.
In the control area, people just did what they normally did, but in the treatment area, we tried to get people to use their bear-proof trash containers. And we wanted to see how that impacted how bears use town.
We've deployed those in 2 different treatment areas, and then we also have 2 paired control areas. And we're looking to see whether wide-scale urban bear proofing is effective at reducing bear-human conflicts in town.
Check some trash. Usually you want to try to get that done before 6, checking to see if wildlife-resistant cans are clips. Since it's a residential can, it's not a wildlife resistant. That's a different code, and the conflict is trash. There are other conflicts, but for my stuff, I usually only have trash, and then I go out and take a picture.
It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to switch to all bear-proof containers. So communities really need to know that it's going to be effective. And so that's what we're actually trying to measure, is whether that management action is effective.
If they tip over a garbage can, they get all the French fries, cheeseburgers they want. That's how bears get so fat, eating junk food, just like people.
Just like people. Okay, so what we did was we collected 4 types of data when we did this experiment. We went out, as you saw in the video there, and we went out 5 a.m. every morning to see how many trash conflicts we saw, like how many, incidences of bears getting their trash cans. We also had all that collar data of bears using town, so we used collar data to see how bears responded to the bear proofing experiment. We also collected some data on people. We looked at how whether people actually complied with the wildlife ordinance. The wildlife ordinance said that you had to have your trash locked up, either secured in a garage or shed, or with a bear-resistant trash container had to be locked to be compliant with the ordinance. And you saw with those cans that you had to have those 2 clips latched to be compliant. So we went around, and as you saw in the video, went around and saw, whether people were compliant with the ordinance. And then we sent out these mail surveys to everyone before we did the experiment, right after, and then a few years later. Okay, so this is what it looked like before we put out the cans in terms of hot spots of conflict. So in town, we had our kind of north treatment and control and our south. And before we put out any cans, we had major hotspots of conflict here, and then kind of throughout this southern zone here. Here's what it looked like after we put out the bear-proof trash containers. We pretty much, conflicts reduced in the treatment areas where we put out the cans, but they also reduced here in the control. I'll talk about why a little bit later. And then in the southern area, I mean, you can see that all these conflicts that were here before, they just kind of got pushed right down to the control. We were really effective at kind of shifting those conflicts into the control area and you know, leaving it in that treatment area that got the containers. During those post-treatment years, after we put up the cans, trash conflicts were about 60% lower in the treatment areas than the controls. And by 2015, more than 80% of the conflicts all occurred just in the control areas. Like we've moved them out of the treatment areas. And we just published a study this past fall where it was led by a PhD student, Cassandre Benemier-Lefebvre at Colorado State University. She did work with me where she looked at how bears were selecting for those treatment and control areas based on their GPS collars and their movement patterns. And what we found over time was that after we put out those bear cans, bears generally started avoiding those treatment areas with the bear cans. That's the green here. They started avoiding the treatment areas and they started selecting more strongly for the control areas. So bears were really learning. You know, not only did our conflicts decline, we assumed that was happening because bears were changing their behavior, but we found too that with this paper that they were indeed changing their behavior. So a bear like, this is bear B27, we see that in terms of her use, that after we put out the bear cans here in 2012, her use of those treatment areas in town is so green, it declined, and her use of the control areas kind of stayed consistent, maybe slightly increased, but was generally consistent, but that use of that treatment area just declined. And what was really cool to see was that change over time. The bears were learning, you know, what we found was these bears were learning. They're learning that they couldn't get these extra food sources in these treatment areas, and so they're starting to avoid those areas. Something else the study showed us was just how important human behavior is in this whole thing. So as I said, we put out all these bear cans, and when I put them out, I was working with a PhD student that was a social scientist, and she said, well, we have to measure if people actually use the bear cans. And I thought that was so crazy because I thought, well, certainly if we give someone a free $250 can, well, of course they're going to use it. And she said, no, Heather, they might not use it at all. They might not clip the locks. And she was completely smart and right on this. And so, you know, that's where we went around to all these houses in the morning to see if they actually locked their cans and if they locked up their trash. And Stacey was right. What we found was that compliance with the ordinance, even when we put out the bear cans, in the treatment area in the north, compliance was only about 80%, and in the south was only 60%. Yeah, a lot of people didn't lock their cans. They could care less. Now, compliance in the control areas, you know, was lower. But what was fascinating, and I'll show you this bit, it increased over time. I'll show you in just a minute. But I show you this for a couple of reasons. One is you can put out the cans and you can put a lot of money and investment into bear-proofing infrastructure. But you've got to have people want to use it and try to take away the barriers for people to use it. Just because it's there doesn't mean, you know, it's going to get used. What we found was that if about 60% of people on your block were complying with the ordinance and locking up their trash, that really reduced your probability of conflict. So there wasn't much kind of additional returns after at least about 60% of your neighbors are all locking up their trash. You are going to have a really low chance of having a conflict with a bear. And that was this kind of like tipping point where if you take away enough food from the landscape, you know, taking away enough food, then it's just not worth it for a bear to be there. And this comes back to that trade-off idea. Bears don't want to be in town. They don't like it. It's kind of scary for them. We know that their heart rates elevate when they come into town and cross roads and things. They don't want to be there. So unless there's a lot of food available to them, it's just not worth it. We also found from our mail surveys, our public mail surveys, that over the course of the experiment, people that got those bear cans, they showed a big increase in their satisfaction with management. They perceived Colorado Parks and Wildlife a lot better, through this whole process of getting this can and helping them reduce their potential for conflicts. So satisfaction with management increased. We saw people increase their support for ordinances. Interestingly, this happened for everyone, whether you're in a treatment area or a control area. Everyone showed greater support for ordinances after this experiment happened. A lot of people in those control areas really wanted a bear can. They wanted, they were really bummed that they were in a control area, not a treatment area. And it changed people's idea about their future risk of conflict. And so generally what we found from these surveys was that, this not only reduced bear conflicts, but it showed these huge social benefits that, that there are benefits for people from this. So putting out these bear cans was ultimately beneficial from both a kind of a human standpoint and a bear standpoint. Okay, so what happened after 2016? Well, we finished our study, and the city of Durango then decided that they were going to take our 2 control areas and that they were going to give all those people bear cans. But at this point, the technology had changed, and by this point, there were these automatically locking bear cans, these self-locking bear cans that were always locked unless you used your thumb to open them. Your, kind of opposable thumbs to open them. So in 2016, the city of Durango went through an effort to deploy a whole bunch more bear cans, but now they're the automatically locking cans. And this set up this perfect opportunity to see, what happened then and how well that changed things. So this shows you during our experimental phase how public compliance looked. So again, this is people that are either locking up their trash in the garage or shed, or they're locking their bear cans. This is when we started the experiment. The red and orange here, these are the trends for people that received one of our bear cans. So they started off, their compliance was higher than the other areas and stayed pretty consistent through the course of the experiment. Now, what's interesting is the people in the control areas, they never got a bear can. That's these, the blue and the green. In both cases, they increased their compliance over the course of the study. Everyone in Durango knew that these cans went out. There was a lot of talk about them. And just that awareness changed a lot of people's behavior in Durango, even if they didn't actually receive a container. Fast forward, 2021, Kassan, the PhD student, went out, looked at compliance again. Now at this point, the people that initially didn't have those bear cans, now they have a self-automatically locking bear can. She estimated their compliance, it was at 95%. So now you put out these bear cans where they're always locked. Now your compliance is 95%, for those people. So kind of take out that whole human error component, which is awesome. Again, the cans that we put out that require you to clip those containers, they've stayed pretty flat over time. But generally, black line is the overall mean. Compliance is really high in Durango now. And what we've seen in terms of the weekly number of conflicts is that, currently conflicts are really low in Durango. Now, importantly, they're not zero. I think, this is important to recognize that you can put a lot of work into this bear-proofing thing and these solutions. And you're probably never going to eliminate conflicts entirely, right? There's always going to be desperate bears that are going to try all kinds of things to get to human food. But you can severely minimize those conflicts. And that's probably what coexistence looks like. You minimize conflicts to a low level that's manageable for people. Okay, so we know what drives conflicts, and we also know a key solution. Lock up the attractants. Lots of ways to do that for lots of different kinds of attractants. Oh, here's my last clip here from the Durango study, from Justice study.
We have a set of tools that we can use to manage bear conflict. But what the research shows is the tools at our disposal as an agency just don't work, really. They don't change human behavior very well. And they don't change bear behavior, that's for sure. What does work, reducing human food. Reducing the benefit of why they come to town while you keep risk high. Tipping that balance, that seems to be what works. Last week, though, we got incredible news at a city council meeting that the city of Durango is using the results of their study to invest $600,000 to bear-proof the rest of Durango. Durango will be one of the first communities in Colorado that really takes this on and just decides as a city, we're just going to have bear-proof trash cans. That's just going to be the new normal here. And we hope that Durango really kind of sets the example for other Colorado communities in bear country on what has to be done. In the past, I think we tried to think of our ecological system, kind of the bears, and the people as two separate things. And certainly as a management agency, that's how we've kind of treated things like bears and other animals as kind of separate from the human system. From our research, we are learning that we just can't do that anymore. Right now, we've got 5.6 million people in Colorado. By 2050, we're supposed to have between 9 and 10 million people. So almost a doubling of our population size in the next 30 years. And this footprint is really going to change as a result of that. So, now more than ever, if we're going to be successful at maintaining large carnivores, we have to think about how do we need to change human behavior. Locking up our trash, taking down our bird feeders, how to support our public lands, our wild spaces that are left. We kind of have to change our thinking to recognizing that we truly do share a single landscape.
Okay, so our study wrapped in 2017, and then I came to Alaska and took a different job. But what's been amazing is to see what's unfolded in those years since. We've seen, from the Durango study, we published about 15 different scientific papers using that data. The research has been used in part to promote bear proofing in a lot of other places. So we saw bear proofing ordinances and practices go into Colorado Springs, into Steamboat Springs, into Manitou Springs, all citing the Durango study as motivation. We saw ordinances go in also to places like Bayfield, Colorado, in recent years, and Frisco, Keystone, Silverthorne. There's been sort of this, this kind of spread of these efforts happening in different towns in Colorado. And elsewhere, we've seen other places too, Missoula being definitely one major switch to bear proofing in the last few years, which kind of domino affected into Potomac, the town to the east, and now the town to the west, Alberton, also is going to go bear proof. So we've seen, where this kind of starts taking hold, there's kind of this domino effect of how it's spreading. And there's been kind of a slew of other benefits that have come from this. And this isn't necessarily all from just the research, but I do think the research has played definitely a role. In Colorado, we saw statewide database on conflicts start to get collected, so the state could really understand where conflicts were happening and how changes to management actions affect those patterns of conflict. In 2021, we saw that Colorado started investing $1 million a year in giving out grants to reduce human bear conflicts. That's happened the last 4 years, I think, which has been huge in driving a lot of this change in that state. So, there's been kind of these just kind of amazing things unfolding, in the years since we did this work. The last thing I just wanted to wrap up with here is, some of the factors that have enabled the spread of these kind of human-based solutions that we've seen, and just kind of wrap up with that. What we've seen is that to get these kind of human-based, kind of bear-proofing ordinances in place, One, the data has been really helpful. Having data on this topic has been incredibly helpful. Now people can go to their municipalities or their city councils, their counties, and be able to show, data on how effective this is going to be and what it's going to do to reduce conflicts. And that's been great. The data is out there. If people have any questions about finding data or information on this, I'm always happy to help. We've seen that public messaging is also incredibly important to adopting these solutions. When I started working in Durango, all the different key entities involved in this topic, everyone had different messaging. We had the county and the city and the State Wildlife Agency and a local nonprofit. Everyone was kind of saying different things and different things, whether the bears were the problem or maybe, growing human development was the problem or, people in different aspects were the problem. Kind of everyone had a different message. Now we're seeing really consistent messaging across all entities, and that's really clearly putting the onus on people and making this change. To help with this, we've also had the help of really compelling public messaging, and that's the beautiful documentary that that Dusty Hewlett made, and that it's going to be screened over the next coming weeks. And actually, I'll just go back here for just a second, we've published a lot of scientific papers on this topic. They don't move people in the same way Dusty's film does. Dusty's film has been amazing because you could take it and show it to a city council or a public venue, and people get it, and they get the issue, and they want to do something about it, and it deeply moves people. And so, as great as all the scientific papers are, this film has been just incredibly effective at moving the needle on this topic. And we've also seen that moving the needle on this really takes these grassroots efforts. It's organizations like your guys's, like Henry Forks Wildlife Alliance, the Bear Yellowstone Coalition. It's community groups, people that really start bringing this to the forefront, pushing their counties, municipalities, their city councils on these ordinances and these changes and things like waste management. We've seen too that these efforts are most effective when there's a lot of diverse people and coalitions at the table. I just grabbed a picture of Lyle and Dusty and I because we are very different people, and we the only way we could have the success that we did was by having a really diverse group of people working on this topic. We had to get so many different people on board to make our research and the messaging make it work. And in some cases, I was not a very effective communicator. There are some people that really did not want to listen to me, or, I was not the right person to motivate folks. Lyle could work with certain user groups in a way that I never could, and vice versa. And so, as you guys take interest in this topic and trying to push for change, I just encourage really diverse coalitions of people, and really welcoming lots of different voices and people to the table, because if you're going to affect, change in our diverse communities, we need a lot of voices here to help do this work. And the last thing is a lot of time. This process takes time. These human-based solutions take time. This is a bear, B27. She was 29 years old when we pulled the collar off of her. She'd been around for decades, seeing so much change that has happened in the greater Durango area in terms of what the landscape change has been. And so, the same way, these solutions can take years, but you can see progress over time. And eventually I see how much has changed just in the years since we finished the study. So, we know that these ecological system and human systems are intertwined, and that there's these really powerful feedback loops between them that strongly contribute to conflict. We know that the availability of human food really alters bear behavior. Meanwhile, those changes in bear behavior drive big increases in conflicts with people. And those conflicts then, can powerfully reduce bear survival and have impacts on bear populations. So if we want to stop these kind of feedback loops from happening, we also know that kind of the most effective way to do that is to work on changing the human system. And that can be really effective at kind of reducing conflicts and working towards coexistence. And, with coexistence, what does that mean? It probably means we have a system where conflicts are low and bear populations, are sustained. And so with that, I really want to thank you because I know this is a long talk. I thank you for hanging in there. And I would just love to take any questions if there's time.
Thank you, Heather, so much for that. You give those of us who are kind of muddling through this process right now in bear country a lot of hope and a lot of tools to work with. I think, folks, if you want to like digitally raise your hand on Zoom, we can kind of moderate questions. Heather, you're getting a lot of like claps and things in the chat here. And then one other thing too, we do have those Bears of Durango screenings. So I'm going to drop a link to our events page in the chat there. And that has, if you scroll down past Heather's talk, that's the top event right now. But you'll see the 3 screenings of Bears of Durango on the 21st in Idaho Falls, 22nd in Ashton, and 23rd up here in Island Park. If you'd like to register, do check that out. All right, let's see what kind of questions we have for Heather.
So if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or even just unmute and you can ask it as well. There's still about 40-ish people on here, or I guess we're down to about 34 right now.
Yeah. I don't see any digital hands raised. So if you want to just unmute and ask a question, you're super welcome to do that too.
This is Mike Abbott in Tetonia. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to thank you, Heather. That was beautiful. I'm so excited about your research, and I hope the word gets out up here in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, because it looks like Colorado's doing great things. I just had a quick question. Well, first comment is, I think it's also important to, and you know this, everybody knows this online, I'm sure, that it's not that hard to lock up attractants. I mean, we've been doing it, our forefathers did it years ago. I mean, because they would lose stuff if they didn't do it. So I think we got to get that word across that we're not talking about huge investments or major efforts to lock up your attractant. But the question I had is, what is your take on the famous saying, "A fed bear is a dead bear"? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a little more like the once a problem bear, always a problem bear, right? Like, yeah, I mean, some bears get super, and I think this is the trick. Some bears do get super habituated. Bears have so many diverse personalities. So there's some bears that are just going to be using human food. We had that with certain bears. B7 that you'll see in the film, she used human food no matter what. So there's always going to be that. But that's what we found was that was more of the exception than the rule. And that, even though some of these bears get human food at certain times, generally that they don't want to be in these human systems and, they get nervous. They don't want to be there. So they'd rather use kind of these natural food resources when they're available. But there's always exceptions. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Heather, it's Justin. I just have a question. So after the time when they put out the new style bear canisters, were there any food years in there where they had where you went through a food failure year? Because I know you have.
Yeah, so this is so fun. It's Jamin. Jamin, are you still there? Jamin is a wildlife biologist in Durango. And I just saw his name pop up in the chat. And so he could probably tell you more about kind of the recent story. But there have been a couple of food failure events since. And that's where Jamin would give better feedback than I could on which years those happened. And they've had conflicts those years for sure, but it hasn't, my understanding from folks there is it hasn't been as elevated as it was like in the past. So I think that's the thing. Like you could have these times when foods are scarce and you're never going to maybe eliminate conflict, especially in those food failure years. Like there will be some, but the overall it's way reduced from what it was before. And I think it's important to remember these bears like got really long memories. Like I showed that graphic of that bear that knew exactly where to go to Durango when it decided it was ready to get that human food. Like who knows how long she had been there, how many years before, she had discovered that. So these bears, I mean, we had bears in our city that were 20 years old, 25 years old. Like these bears have long memories. So I think, we should expect that some of these patterns are going to take a while to break. A bear might have used a food source 3, 4, 5 years before that tries to use it again. And that, I think that was really cool then to see that in our kind of our recent paper was that this evidence of bears learning over time. They're just so smart and they'll try something again for sure. So we should kind of expect that there is going to be a learning phase once we kind of implement these actions.
Yeah, hi everybody. Since Heather called me out, I'll just jump in and help with that question if I can. As Heather mentioned, I am a biologist in Durango with Parks and Wildlife. Yeah, Heather's work definitely has an ongoing legacy in Durango and throughout Colorado. And this year we had probably the worst food failure year I've ever seen. It was terrible this last summer. It was probably as bad as 2012, maybe, in my opinion, it's the worst I've ever seen. It was horrible. And I do think we've seen a reduction in conflicts largely because of what came from Heather's work. So I do think it has a lasting impact, and Heather's work she certainly left a legacy in Colorado. So we miss her.
Thanks, Jamin. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jamin. It's great for you to weigh in. With that, sorry, Jamin, I just got one to follow up on that. Like, with this high food year, did you still see pretty high bear mortality, or is that still fairly low?
That's a really good question. We don't have bears collared anymore. So since Heather's research has ended, we don't have the bears collared, so we can't measure, direct like annual survival the way that Heather was. I do think we probably had high mortality this year. I think we probably had high hunter harvest because the bears were stacked into the very few places where they could find food, and they were easy for hunters to find for that reason. And I suspect we did probably have very high natural mortality, and so yeah, it was a bad year for bears down here. I'm sure we did have mortality, but certainly the changes with trash containment that came from Heather's work. That's made a very positive impact for sure.
Thank you.
Marianne, did you want to ask your question?
I do, thank you. So, is there similar research about camping? I don't camp with walls around me. I sleep out. And I'm curious, there are some obvious things I can do and obvious things that relate to this, but is there any research directly around camping and bears?
I don't know of any research per se, but the big thing would be just not to camp with food. Have your food far from you. We have nothing with scent around, around you.
Yeah, I do that. Just curious if there was anything else.
All right, we've got about 3 minutes left. Does anybody else have any lingering questions?
I have one.
I have a quick question. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I already asked mine. I'll ask it if you have time.
Okay. I'm Jean Bierke. I'm with Henry's Fork Wildlife Alliance, and I'm pleased that several other members of our board, plus Justin and Allison, are all involved in this. Heather, great talk, very helpful. I have a quick question. Your research is fabulous, and we can use a lot of your conclusions, I think, in our group with our outreach. But your research is obviously on black bears. We're mostly in the Island Park area dealing with grizzly bears. I'm not a biologist, but my just general assumption would be that bear behavior between the two species is probably very similar. But if we were to run into skeptics that say, oh, you know, that research was all on black bears, our area is different, what would you say?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a great one. Yeah, I mean, what is cool is now there's research done on lots of places on different bear species that all shows the same thing. So we see the same thing with grizzly bears, brown bears, that conflicts spike when you have these natural food, the kind of failure years, and that locking up attractants is effective. So there's research not just from our work on black bears, but we see it. There's research from Europe on brown bears. There's research from Canada and the U.S. on grizzly bears. I mean, so there's research to support these changes with bear species too.
Yeah, we'll look that up. Thank you.
Same. Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, folks.
Mike had a question.
Mike, did you want to ask your question?
I just one more quick one. This is kind of not on the bear, but you mentioned Durango invested $600K and Colorado invested $1 million to reduce human bear conflicts. Do you know where that funding, how they got that funding?
Yeah, great question. So the city has invested, yeah, it's even more now, but the initial investment was like 600,000. But yeah, even more now. And they were really smart about it. They saw the results from the study. They knew that the kind of end game was to figure out how to bear-proof Durango entirely. And they increased the price a little bit on their kind of the waste management side of things in Durango. And then they did it over time. Like they saved for like 3 or 4 years, kind of in anticipation of spending all this money on infrastructure. And then they tackled different chunks, like in different years. 2018, they did cans for like one chunk of town. In 2019, they did another. And they've been working to try to bear-proof the city, kind of tackling in chunks based on finances like that. But yeah, so that's kind of how they've done it. The state, the $1 million grants that have gone out in Colorado, that's been at the level of the state legislature. And the governor made that priority, and it was pushed. It was a bill that passed that had bipartisan support, and and support from the governor. So they've done that $1 million a year, kind of just as a state priority. It's amazing.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for showing up and talking to us and just presenting this really important information that can help communities in eastern Idaho and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to try to address some of our human bear conflicts. We really appreciate you. Thanks to GYC for partnering with us on this, and with all of Dusty's films coming up next week. We're all partnering up on that, us and GYC. So do use that link in the chat, and that'll get you to GYC's registration form. So we just know how many people to anticipate. Justin and I are going to be cooking for Ashton and Island Park. So we just want to know how many folks we should make food for. And we hope to see as many of you there as can get out. It'll be a really good time. And as you saw those clips, it looks like an absolutely fabulous film. So you're going to love it. All right. Well, thank you everybody so much. We'll go ahead and log off, and we'll make sure to get this video over to Julia and the folks at GYC, and they'll get it sent out to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
Yes, thanks, Heather.
Thank you,
great.
Heather.
Everyone.
Fantastic.